Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, and it's good to see you, Daniel.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Well, there's some news today about a former colleague of mine, and he's in the news a lot, and that's Bernie Sanders, and he's doing well. He's getting large crowds out. But there was an article recently about his foreign policy, and I want to talk a little bit about that because, in particular, the article was dealing with his policies in the Middle East, and one title was Sanders' Screwy Mideast Strategy, and we'll go into that a lot. But when in Congress, Bernie was an interesting person. I got along with him fine because there were things that we could work with. Sometimes he was anti-corporation. Sometimes he was pro-civil liberty. Sometimes he was anti-war. And it seemed like he was okay, and he worked with me on the Federal Reserve as well. But it was never complete, and sometimes it was sort of like, is he neutralizing us and settling for a little bit less? But the one thing is he's been known as a progressive, and the progressive Democrats generally like him, and even some libertarians sort of like him, thinking that he might be really anti-war. But when we look into this, we find out, that his positions aren't exactly pro-liberty.
Yeah, that's the problem with some people. They want to support the least bad of them, and so I think that's why probably a lot of your former your supporters have leaned toward him. But this was an article in the consortiumnews.com, Robert Perry's site, written by Sam Husseini, and it's talking about several interviews that Sanders has done, and essentially his position on the Middle East is that we need to back Saudi Arabia and urge them to be much more aggressive in the region and take over and take charge of the region. And as Husseini writes out, this is a screwy foreign policy.
This wouldn't exactly satisfy a true progressive. I don't think this would be Dennis Kucinich's position. Dennis, of course, was very close to us on foreign policy, but in this case, a true progressive wouldn't be. But he still has credibility with the progressives. But how can it be a progressive to push Saudi Arabia? And it's such a controversial country. And I have said in the past something somewhat similar in that they ought to take care of their own business over there. Saudi they live there, they ought to take care of it. But that's quite a bit different than us being such close allies with the Saudis. And this war going on is a major issue. I was commenting to you the other day, it's probably been a long time since we've seen the Saudi troops going across borders and invading a country. They've been involved, just like all the countries in the Middle East, and we're the king of all interveners, around the world. But they have troops in there last couple of days, and it's significant because of the price of oil. I keep arguing that sometimes I don't have to read the news of the world if I just look at the financial market. So if you see oil jumping $8, something's going on, and I think this is a reflection of this. And this means that there's trouble there. They must feel like they're not accomplishing it since we've joined forces openly, and we were doing all the bombing, and we were going to stop the Houthis and make sure the Saudis would and the Sunnis would win this war. This looks like it's not working, and they're trying a new strategy. I wonder what that means for the United States. I hope it doesn't mean that we'll be involved literally with troops, but we are very much involved. The Saudis are very well armed, whether or not they know how to use them as well as others, but they're very well armed. But now they've marched into this country. I think it has a great deal of significance.
Well, they started bombing Yemen in March, in the spring, and it's really created, and this is with U.S. not only blessing, but actual intelligence support, targeting information, this sort of thing. So the U.S. is definitely involved in this. It's created one of the greatest humanitarian catastrophes in recent memory, yet you'll never see it mentioned on the mainstream media. You'll never see all of the humanitarians in the Obama administration talking about it. Half of the country's 43 million people face catastrophic famine right now because of the Saudi bombing. The Saudis want to reinstall the president that the Saudis and the U.S. installed, who was overthrown. So it's not like they're fighting for democracy, and besides, the Saudis are really not a good example.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing. Of course, us being close to the Saudis, one thing, it probably has a lot more to do with oil. But for the progressives to be supporting somebody who's so anti-progressive, because if you look at what the Saudis has done in recent history, they're very much involved in 9/11 and the financing of 9/11. That's pretty much evident. And also, their civil liberties are atrocious. You know, they had a lot more people than Al Qaeda and ISIS. So they're not exactly a very good example. And to argue the case that we should emphasize that they do more makes no sense whatsoever.
Well, also the Saudis have been very involved. They've been very involved in Syria. But who have they backed? They've backed Al Qaeda in Syria. They've not backed moderates, if there were any, to begin with. So they've been very involved. The other thing is that Saudi Arabia and Israel both have the same strategic goals in the Middle East, which is to marginalize Syria as a unified power and then to go after Iran. So you see this sort of that axis that Sanders is supporting.
Yeah, no, that might be the factor. That might be why, you know, he'd like to have the image. He's not arguing that he doesn't want support from the progressives, but his voting record hasn't been all that great either on some of the things that he supported, and he, I think, has not opposed anything that Israel would want him to vote for.
Well, he voted for the Iran, basically the Iran Regime Change Act, which put up additional sanctions and tightened the screws on Iran back in the 2000s. Actually, as I was researching this, I was surprised, and Justin Raimondo wrote about this too, that he backed a move to make permanent several key factors, several key issues in the Patriot Act as well. So, but going back before that, he supported the attacks on Kosovo, you know, and so his record certainly is not very good in the anti-war area.
Of course, you know, in desperation, sometimes in Washington, you're just hoping somebody will come our way. And on occasion they do, and they switch. You take a Walter Jones, who not only became anti-war, he has become very much pro-civil liberties. It's 12 too. But so much of it is done for pragmatic and reasons to support special interests, whether it's oil or financiers or banks or Israel or whatnot. And that is generally what drives it. But you know, that title to that article about Sanders was Sanders' screwy Mideast strategy. But don't you think we could apply that term to a lot more than just Sanders?
Yeah, and you'd hope it's just a, you know, kind of a throwaway. He's not really sure what to do, so he throws that out. But, you know, for progressive who wants to build America and, you know, build up the infrastructure, his support of the military-industrial complex is significant. He's been a big supporter of the F-35, and his whole point when he argues that we need to support Saudi Arabia is that they are the third largest purchaser, the third largest spender in the military in the world, and all that stuff is bought from us.
I wonder if you could make a case that he's not too far removed from a neoconservative.
In some ways, although it's a left interventionist, you know,
Yeah.
which is, it has a humanitarian flavor, but when you're on the receiving end of the bombs, it doesn't feel any better.
Well, that same question could be thrown at the president, too. You know, we see him on one side maybe seeking peace and opening up the doors to Cuba and changing the policy with Iran. At the same time, he's starting more wars elsewhere. But understand the next Friday, the president is going to meet with King Saud, is it? And with the king of Saudi Arabia, and who refused to meet with the president, you know, a few months ago when they had a meeting with the Gulf region countries at Camp David. Mm-hmm. So they're going to meet next time, and the whole purpose is the administration is arguing that Iran has softened a little bit, and they want to close the deal so that the Saudis won't object to this resolution with Iran. So in one sense, you know, you see the stirring up and antagonism and the bombs falling and our allies invading countries, and we're blowing things up in Ukraine. At the same time, there's this feeler out there with Iran, you know, to open up the door there and remove sanctions. So I guess the one thing that makes it hard for me and so many others is that inconsistencies seem to annoy me. And why do they do it? But it's almost like inconsistencies are what you do. And in a way, utilitarianism and pragmatism that's the purpose of it. It's a philosophy in itself. It isn't that you take a position of non-intervention and empire. No, we take a position of intervention. This is the way it is in economics. No, we don't want total freedom. That's too abusive. But we don't want total socialism. So then you get people in there managing things. Then you argue over management, and it's always just the management thing. And this is, I think, what's going on right now is not so much that Republicans would have a different foreign policy. They want to change management. They think we could do it better. We could send in troops sooner. We could send in more troops, and we can be in more places, and we won't quit so easily, rather than saying, well, maybe we shouldn't be there. And I'd like to think the American people, if they had all the information, they say, yeah, why are we there? Why don't we just quit all this intervention?
Yeah, absolutely. And the Saudis are rather cynical because they are going into Yemen right now when they know that Iran has got to really behave itself. Its hands are tied. Although Iran does not specifically back the Houthis in Yemen, they're sympathetic to them, but they don't dare do anything. So the Saudis are not stupid people.
You know, today we've been talking about the problems in Yemen and our relationship with Saudi Arabia and what is done. But the significance here immediately in the financial markets is that there was a big jump in the oil prices, reflecting that this is a significant event. And it also means that the fact that oil has gone down sharply doesn't mean it's going to keep going down for a long time. This has happened before, and there's some various factors. You have the dollar. If the dollar goes down, oil prices are going to go up. And then there's also the supply and demand. All of a sudden, maybe China will start using oil more so. But then there's also these geopolitical problems of interference. If this is accentuated and there's a bigger war there and supplies are cut off from the Middle East and the deal doesn't go through with Iran and they're cut off, who knows what happens? You could have an explosion of the oil prices, but that remains to be seen. But to assume that oil was a 120, probably was up there because we had inflation, and now it's made this a correction. Well, my long-term prediction is you're going to see oil over $100 again, whether not next month, but maybe next year or so, or if some major crisis comes along. So these events are very important, but the worst part of these events in this chaos and this ridiculous foreign policy is the threat to ourselves, our financial well-being, and to our freedoms and liberty, and the incentive for the Islamic State to develop. You know, we've talked so often about the various groups. Just in Syria, there are 3 different Islamic groups getting together and fighting each other and who wants to take over. But the one thing that unifies all these groups is anti-Americanism. And that is the tremendous incentive for people to resent our presence there, and they will come together and they'll fight some other day for who gets to control. But right now, the unifying thing is anti-Americanism, and unfortunately, that is not good for us. Someday, we should wake up and realize that the founders were right. The less we're involved, the less entangling alliances that we're engaged in, the more we depend on free markets and freedom and willingness to trade with people and avoid all these conflicting associations with the countries around the world. We don't need an empire to thrive. Matter of fact, the empire always fails. And I think what we're witnessing today is the opening bell to the failure of our empire and the failure of the dollars. Pretty good evidence right now, China selling treasuries. And they actually even told our government that they were, because they don't want to cause chaos. They want to keep selling at a gradual level. But that may be contagious, and other countries might decide, hey, it's about time to sell treasuries. Then no matter what the Fed does, interest rates will go up. That day will come. We don't know when, but we ought to be prepared, and we ought to think about how we rebuild this system and how we can concentrate once again on free markets, property rights, sound money, and individual liberty. That's what we need. That's what would solve our problems. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.